On December 7th, 1941, everything changed for the lives of Japanese Americans. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese military, Japanese Americans were suddenly marked as outsiders in a country they had always called home. The peak of this exclusion can be marked on February 19, 1942, when President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, allowing the Secretary of War and military commanders to create military areas from which any or all persons may be excluded, and with respect to which the right of any person to enter, remain in, or leave shall be subject to whatever restrictions the Secretary of War or the appropriate military commander may impose in his discretion. This executive order led to the relocation of 120,000 Japanese Americans to 10 permanent internment camps on the west coast of the United States. These Japanese Americans had 5 days after the official notice of their removal in which to sell, rent, loan, store, or give away their real property and possessions, and often faced curfews and warrantless searches of their homes before they left. Sadly, this is not the only struggle Japanese Americans faced. Before the Second World War, the Japanese faced many different prejudices in America. In the early years of the 20th century, some Californians tried to implement school segregation for Japanese students. And in the years before World War II, several laws were passed to discriminate against Japanese Americans, most notably the California Alien Land Law in 1913 and the Immigration Act of 1924. The California Alien Land Law was passed to forbid first-generation Japanese immigrants from owning land. This forced Japanese immigrants to put their property under their children's name in order to keep their land. This prejudice only worsened with the passing of the Immigration Act of 1924. In this act, Congress prohibited new immigration from Japan and all other Asian countries. These laws called attention to the underlying prejudice against the Japanese that would be revealed during World War II. Japanese Americans also faced education discrimination during the war. In February 1942, about 7,500 NICE students found themselves unable to continue their education. Only a fourth of American higher education institutions would accept Japanese American students at the time. This meant that during the war, students had three options: to stay incarcerated, join the military, or beg for university acceptance. C. Leonard London, a history professor at Indiana University, stated, "It is an injustice for universities in the central part of the country to refuse, as most of the great ones have done, to admit any considerable number of these deserving and often brilliant young Americans, whose only fault is their ancestry." These students had no choice to continue their education, and it was unconstitutional to refuse education to a racial group. In these internment camps, the Japanese Americans wrote their own newspapers that give a deeper insight into what life inside of these camps may have looked like. In a newspaper from Manzanar, it stated, "It costs the authority $1.20 a day to maintain each evacuee, about $17 in present day, and even that amount was considered too high in the opinions of some Americans who thought that affording the Japanese decent treatment is coddling." In relocating to these camps, Japanese Americans could bring very few items with them. For each member of the family, bedding and linens, toilet articles, extra clothing, sufficient forks, spoons, plates, bowls, and cups, and essential personal effects were to be taken. Everything else had to be left behind. When the evacuees made it to the camps, they were also given very little. For each person, an army cot, a blanket, and a sack, which could be filled with straw to make a mattress. There is nothing else. The internment camps were also situated in very harsh desert climates that were hit with cold winters and very hot summers. These camps were open for 3 years, and residents had never received a fair trial before being interned. Sadly, most Americans did not object to Japanese incarceration. A nationwide poll found that 89% of Americans favored denying alien Japanese equal rights, and 97% of the West Coast Americans approved of the removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans. This prejudice did not end after the war. Many Japanese Americans were victims of arson and hate crimes when they returned back to their homes. Terrorists fired shots into the homes of no fewer than 15 Japanese American families, and arsonists and vandals destroyed property belonging to at least 50 other families. And specifically, a group of white Californians set fire to a house near San Jose and then shot at the occupants as they tried to douse the flames. In addition to these horrendous acts, Japanese Americans were on the receiving end of multitudes of stereotypes during the war, especially in the media. Movies and newspapers propagated the idea of all Japanese Americans as traitors to the United States. In an editorial called Yellow Peril, anti-Japanese material was very present, stating, "A characteristic among Japanese is their propensity for spying. Japan intends to make California its Manchurian fields." This sentiment only bolstered racial prejudice in the masses, and soon private citizens also tried to prevent the Japanese Americans' return to the West Coast. In 1944, a small Washington state press printed a pamphlet entitled "The Japs Must Not Come Back." The pamphlet's author, Lambert Schuller, expressed the racial fears that motivated some of the verbal attacks on Japanese Americans. Many Japanese Americans faced employment and real estate discrimination as well. Restrictions in certain unions, prejudiced attitudes of employers or employees, and lack of nicely skilled men had been some of the main factors interfering with the employment of the Nicey. The Japanese American people were now outcasts in their communities, and their lives would be drastically different from the lives they had lived before the war. Japanese Americans did not lose their patriotic spirit from the prejudices that they faced. Japanese soldiers played a large role in the victory in World War II. These soldiers primarily made up the 442nd Infantry Regiment, the most decorated unit in American history. This unit received over 18,000 awards, including 9,486 Purple Hearts, 4,000 Bronze Stars, and 21 Medals of Honor, with a total of 14,000 men serving in the unit overall. They fought in Europe and helped win back the Lost Battalion. Truman stated that these soldiers were very honorable because they fought not only the enemy, but also prejudice, and they had won. The prejudices, exclusion, and internment of Japanese Americans was a direct result of the fears of Americans during World War II. Not a single documented case of espionage, sabotage, or fifth column activity was committed by an American citizen of Japanese ancestry or by a resident Japanese alien on the West Coast. This treatment was against constitutional rights, and the loss of liberty for Japanese Americans will always be remembered as a bad time in our nation's history. The personal stigma of suspected disloyalty for thousands of people who knew themselves to be devoted to their country's cause and to its ideals, but whose repeated protestations of loyalty were discounted, was a difficult hurdle that Japanese Americans were forced to overcome to gain back pride in a country who believed they were traitors. We hope that these wounds have healed, but we know this is difficult because the promulgation of Executive Order 9066 was not justified by military necessity, and the decisions which followed from it, detention, and ending exclusion, were not driven by analysis of military conditions. The broad historical causes which shaped these decisions were race, prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. It is important that this prejudice seen towards Japanese Americans surrounding World War II is not repeated to any other group in America. In Proclamation 4417 by President Gerald Ford, he states, "We now know what we should have known then, not only that evacuation was wrong, but Japanese Americans were and are loyal Americans. On the battlefield and at home, Japanese Americans have been and continue to be written in our history for the sacrifices and the contributions they have made to the well-being and security of this, our common nation." The United States government did decide to give reparations to Japanese Americans for this unjust treatment. Truman signed the Japanese American Claims Act, which approximated $38 million to settle all property claims, granting around $20,000 to each survivor, and in the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, previously incarcerated Americans were also granted reparations. The Civil Liberties Act was meant to acknowledge the fundamental injustice of evacuation, relocation, and internment, apologize on behalf of the people of the United States, provide public education fund to finance efforts to inform the public about the internment, discourage the occurrence of similar injustices and violations of civil liberties in the future, and make more credible and sincere any declaration of concern by the United States over violations of human rights committed by other nations. By learning about our country's mistakes, we can make sure that these mistakes are not again.